Welcome to another episode looking at the how and most importantly why in photography. My name is Gabriel Leung, and in this channel I will break down one word at a time within art and design language that will help you to spend more time to create and less time to think about what gear is missing. Today we'll be looking at probably the most important idea of perspective, finding your own perspective. Welcome to the channel. So perspective is probably one of the most important findings in human history in relation to photography. During the Renaissance, artists are obsessed with depicting something as real as possible, and especially three-dimensional space, onto a two-dimensional surface, such as a painting or a drawing. But we all know that this is just an abstract concept. Depicting something as real life doesn't necessarily entitle it as good art. And so the question we want to ask, what makes perspective the one and most important thing in photography? So perspective is about relativity between us and the world as a whole, and our eyes being the center of it. Therefore, whether you are a hobbyist, an amateur, or a professional photographer, the utmost important thing about photography is to find your unique perspective. It's like looking at a glass, whether it's half full or half empty. You can change your angle and perspective looking at it. The level of water doesn't change. It all depends on how you perceive the glass as the eye of the beholder. So let's go through 3+1 tips on how we can make use of this concept. Tip number 1, the lines, is to understand the use of parallel and converging lines. Shooting something straight on creates a very flat image. It is considered sometimes a boring angle for a lot of photographers, but this is actually a very common thing to do when dealing with architectural and interior photography, when we're maintaining the vertical lines being parallel going up and down, but the horizontal lines are converging on the sides. It creates a very neutral, stable, and objective view on the space. So when we change from shooting straight on to moving to the side and shooting a subject from an angle, it reveals depths in your scene with the help of converging lines. Now, Renaissance artists are obsessed with converging lines because they discovered that there are vanishing points where these lines lead to, even though it's outside the picture frame. And these lines are the main ingredients of your dish. These lines will lead to your main subject. It leads to a focal point. It's the end of the journey of your eyes. So based on the understanding of the lines, the shift uses variable degree of adjustments to throw the lines off, such as tilting your camera. Now this creates a very dynamic look, and it also gives your viewer a sense of instability. Like even a static image is always appearing to be changing or moving. I would call this dynamic angle. It's very easy and everyone should try it. The shift can also play with devaluing gravity by placing your camera or your subject in very obscured orientation, flipping the camera upside down, or even switching the orientation of the image after you've captured it. And also the shift can also create an illusion of surrealism in your work. Especially when you interact with the foreground, placing a subject there or asking them to get very close to your lens. Super effective when you're using a wide-angle lens. Now, if you're thinking you don't have a wide-angle lens and don't have the money to buy one, most phones are equipped to shoot wide by default. So now you know. Tip number 3, connotation. What makes perspective the most important concept in photography is this last tip, connotation. It is an abstract concept to communicate ideas and to invoke feelings without using words, such as storytelling. Telling a story about your subject using camera angle from a particular perspective. You shoot from one side because you wanted to say something. There is a reason to place your camera and view the subject from that particular perspective. Whether it is also a wide or a telephoto, tells a different story. You want to tell the relationship between the subject and the atmosphere, or you want to tell the emotion of the subject, you want to close in on them. First-person perspective invites the viewer to enter into the picture space. They are almost like the character going through the motion and seeing the world from that perspective. Lowering the camera, tilting upward to shoot a person establishes as a hero shot to show their importance. Aerial perspective emphasizes on the distance, scale, and our overall relationship with the environment. The list just goes on about perspective and how it uses connotation to suggest something. The perspective you choose, it has to always mean something. Like you're trying to say something with that perspective that you have chosen. So lastly is the +1 tip. Now why do I add a +1 tip in every single video? Because there is always 3 main tips as a foundation. They are all very important. But the +1 tip is something that elevates you beyond that level, or something to be mindful of when you are dealing with that particular concept in photography. So for today's +1 tip is to be mindful about shooting people, especially when you're working with portraits and fashion. Because with perspective, there are certain principles that you want to be aware of, that is foreshortening of something. Now, if you're shooting a person from down low tilting upward, you're actually foreshortening their upper body, and so their lower body appears longer, such as their legs. And if you're shooting from a high above downward towards them, you're foreshortening their lower body, making their height look shorter. Now think of it as a rule to follow and to break. It really depends on what you're trying to create and what you're trying to communicate. So here's the take-home tip. I've been talking a lot about why and how the viewer perceives perspective within this concept, but the take-home tip is a little bit more about how to get you started. And today's take-home tip is to lean against something. As a viewer, we always want to see something new, and that includes a new, fresh perspective. It's not as hard as you might think. It really means standing and shooting from somewhere that no one else does. And to get you started, I would suggest to lean against, place your camera, or get extremely close to a surface such as a wall, a floor, or attach it to a ceiling. It will give your viewer a very fresh perspective. So now you've learned all these tips, you will have to make use of them before you forget. So challenge yourself and go out there and shoot some architecture with tip number 1 and 2. Watch a film and take notes on all the angles that intrigue you. And also find a friend as a model and shoot from all the perspective and angles that you can think of until you run out of ideas. I hope you enjoyed this video and you have learned something new. Comment down below to see how you use perspective in your work. I will be curious to know. Give me a thumbs up if you do, and if you haven't, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. And also follow me on Instagram to get periodic inspirations and updates. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.